Hello, this is a presentation which was given at the SIOP conference in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on April 24th, 2015. This is a symposium on invalid data in self-report surveys, and what I'm going to be talking about today is looking at responses to these sorts of attention check items using a verbal protocol analysis. Now, careless response is a sort of area that's been growing in recent years, and the idea is that this careless or insufficient effort response occurs when individuals do not put forth enough effort to respond thoughtfully to any given item. There are a lot of ways that this can occur, and broadly the idea is that having this data in other survey data is really opening yourself up to some negative impacts. There's a number of studies that look at this, and there's a lot of ways that this could play out. It could be positive relationships, increasing positive relationships, negative relationships. It could weaken effects, strengthen effects. There's a lot of odd things that can go on simply due to the fact that this information that's being placed in through this careless process has some random element to it, or at the very least has some element that is not linked back to the true valid scores. Now, there are a number of ways we can detect these types of response patterns in a data set. There's a number of those that have been looked at in other things in the same symposium, in other papers. And one of these methods, though, is through embedding these sort of unique items to catch individuals who are not displaying the sort of thought and attention to recognize them as items that really only have one correct answer. Now, the whole idea here of these attention check items is that they are face valid. They look like items that might be embedded in a scale of this sort. They're very different, though. There's two main scales that we're going to look at here, two of the main published scales. Mead and Craig 2012, and then Hoying et al. 2014. And these include items like I've been to every country in the world, I'm paid biweekly by leprechauns, I eat cement occasionally, I work 14 months a year. These sorts of strange items that are assumed to really just have one correct answer on a Likert scale. Now we could take a look at one of these. All my friends say I would make a great poodle. This is an item from one of those scales, and the idea would be that this would be embedded with items, personality items, say I'm the life of the party, for instance, if we were measuring extroversion. Now on a scale like this, the answer to all my friends say I would make a great poodle should be disagree, right? This is a case where someone who's paying attention would be assumed to be disagreeing to this statement. If they agreed to it, or if they agreed to something like I eat cement occasionally, they'd be captured in this zone of presumed inattentiveness. Now we're using a cut here of these last two, which is from Mead and Craig for this study, but there are also different ways you can do this and then cut sort of deeper or thinner on this on the scale, and it would really just increase the would shift the types of error that we'll be talking about in this presentation. The problem with this is that other methods and this method really are meant to classify individuals. That is the end goal of this. There's really no other reason to be using these sorts of items. The end goal of this classification is elimination of those individuals from a response set in order to clean this data. This is inherently a data cleaning method, and this classification, this elimination of individuals, and realistically the retention of some of these individuals may be correct or may be an error. Now, if we think about these scales as classifying individuals over on this left side, we could either classify them as valid or classify them as invalid. Now, based on what they actually are, and right now this is, at this point in the presentation, this is kind of behind a curtain, so to speak. If they actually are a valid responder and we classify them invalid, then we're incorrectly eliminating those individuals. If we classify them as valid, but they're invalid, then we're incorrectly retaining them, right? These are pieces of error off this diagonal of the places we want to be, right? Where we want to classify them correctly and eliminate those that are actually invalid, or retain those that are actually valid. Now you can see that this maps pretty easily, if we think about the elimination process as an action in this state, a sort of end result, that positive hit on this metric, that we could frame this in terms of your common research methods, type 1, type 2 error ratios, right? We have some true negatives, true positives, which we really want, but we also have these false negatives and false positives. Now, this isn't new to this area, and there's a lot of other studies that have examined this false positive, false negative hit rate on other metrics. The trick with these other metrics and other methods, though, is that they're much more statistically, numerically based, and can use simulation to examine these error rates. You can inject random data into this process and see how it plays out. The short of this is that we could simulate response very easily. We could also instruct individuals to act as if they are acting carelessly. These are very easy things to do on a lot of these other methods. What we're not getting at, though, is the thought process that leads to those responses. That makes it a lot harder to get at that same error rate on these sorts of items. The goal of this study, then, is to examine these reasons, the reasons why participants select the answers that they do, and then use that information to start to assess some of this error rate. Right? This is a sort of unique situation we're putting individuals into. So this is going to be an approximation, and certainly some lower and upper bounds. But it does start to paint the first picture of how these might really be playing out. So to get a feel for this, we constructed a 40-item battery of these attention check items. There were 8 items from the Huang et al., all of their items. 9 of the 10 items from Mead and Craig. There was 1 item on whether or not individuals were taking a psychology class currently, and the pool we were using had some students who were in psychology classes, but other classes as well, so we decided not to use that item. We used 5 items that are very commonly used, these answer with something for this item. It could be agree, strongly agree, disagree, so forth. 4 items, we decided to pull some sort of off-the-shelf things that people might be tempted to use to get at the same idea. 4 items from the unusual belief scale that could be found on the IPIP. 3 items that are sort of based on this idea of knowledge faking, kind of modeled after this paper by Hargitay that was used more in the computer science literature. And then 11 other items generated by the authors in keeping with the framework of all these items. We originally started this with the mindset of trying to figure out some of the categories of these items, which is beyond the scope of this presentation, but is where some of these items come from. But we did spend a decent amount of time piecing these together and trying to pull out the best of them to match these other scales. So our methods included taking 59 participants from a small liberal arts college and administering them these 40 items. These items were randomized within the individual, so each participant got a random order but did receive all 40 items. What was different here, though, than a sort of normal administration is we put a microphone in front of them and instructed the participants to talk through their thought process leading to each of their responses and to justify their response to these questions. We recorded them and made no secret of the fact they were being recorded in order to then recode those responses by item to see whether or not they provided some valid justification of the response on that item. What this allows us to do then is to go back to that earlier table and look at these things at the top, which before we just sort of had to speculate about, but now that we can replace with this coding. So we still have the classification that's going on. We're looking at whether or not these items are going to classify without this information an individual as valid or invalid. This is the sort of practical day-to-day use of these scales. But now what we can drop on here is our coding, this coding that you wouldn't have in a normal situation, to see if these are matching up and if we're correctly retaining, incorrectly eliminating, and so forth on each of these responses. So we could look at these by scale, and we'll start with the Huang et al. Scale. And what we're seeing here are these columns that relate to the different proportion of individuals that fall into each of those cells of that table on each item. Now, there are some limitations here, and in the fact that true positives, so individuals who don't justify their answer and also respond in a way that would flag them, are going to be exceptionally rare in this study, simply because of the fact that participants are being told to speak out their answers and are much more highly motivated than a normal sample. So this column is not something we're going to focus on here, and we really don't have the power to focus on if anything were to come up there. What we're really interested in is the difference between these true negatives. So these are the people who provide a valid response, both to the item, what would be done practically, and to the justification, that they provide some justification for this. We want that number to be as high as possible. As well, the false positives are really the place where we have some power here. These are places where we're coding that the individuals gave a valid response, but the item would have flagged them as invalid. Now, what we can see here on the Huang scale is that the majority of these items are really doing pretty well. We have a few up here that have no false positive rate. Some have minimal throughout here, but there are a few at the bottom that are not doing great, including this last one. I'm interested in pursuing a degree in parabenjology. Has a very high false positive rate. Punished for meeting the requirements of my job the same way. But for the most part, this scale, if looked at as a whole, is doing fairly well. The same sort of plays out with Mead and Craig's scale, their 2012 scale. That a lot of these items have very low hit rates of false positives. You're seeing a little bit here, a little bit here, and a bit weaker at the end of the scale. And again, I've ordered these by their quality, not by administration. These were all administered randomly. But especially this one, all my friends say I would make a great poodle. All my friends are aliens. We're getting some false positive hits there. We had those answer with items on there, a few different ones, an agree, a disagree, strongly agree, and then the neutral option. And this was an unexpected result. A lot of this study was realistically exploratory, but this result was very unexpected. What we found here is that while there were some false positives on here, which are actually odd when you start to think about it, what we really had here was a huge spike, 1 in 3 individuals, roughly, that were hitting false negatives on these items. And the way that this was playing out is that they were providing justifications to all other answers, all other items. But when they got to these items, they were simply answering agree and not justifying it. Now, 2 out of 3 individuals did. They would say things like, oh, this item says to agree, so I am going to agree. That is a different mindset to simply ignore the justification on these items than these individuals put forth on all other items. This, again, since it's exploratory, we don't really have a good answer for this, but it does seem to be making a case that individuals are viewing these items differently than the other items, even these other fairly bizarre items on this scale. And they're doing it consistently. This number is fairly consistent. Now, looking at those other sort of off-the-shelf scales, the items from the unusual belief scale, they didn't have any items that were great. None that had no items that had a sort of 0 hit rate on false positives, but instead a lot here that were kind of in this 5 to 10% range. There are also a handful of false negatives here, but slightly higher than earlier. And the Hargitay items, the ones that we came up with to sort of model after this first one, really just did not work well at all. These had a very high false positive rate. Our generated items as well had a very different false positive rate than some of these other scales. Well, we had some good items here. We had some weaker items as well, especially some of these that we dropped in that are much more turns of phrase than a real item here with a very hard and fast correct answer, but something that a researcher might be tempted to drop in if they were creating this scale on their own. We do have some good items here, but this scale, on the whole, there are some problems with it. Now, one of the big questions would be, what's actually going on here? What's driving these false positives? And knowing that would be a big question here, we compiled some of them to look at some of the common things that are showing up on a sample of these responses. So some of the items, like all my friends are aliens, they're kind of reading differently on what aliens might mean, right? That there's a broad scale of potential language there. Some of these items, like parabiology, the combinatorial English, these items with made-up words in them are capturing people who answered neutrally and said that they didn't want to disagree because it might be real. People who were questioning whether or not this was something real and whether or not they simply didn't know what it was. They were expressing that they might be ignorant on this topic and then didn't want to say that it was something that they disagreed with. They were erring on the side that they simply didn't know what it was. The items from the unusual belief scale, for whatever reason, perhaps because this wasn't in a clinical context, people read into quite liberally and really came up with some creative things like that they kind of understand what others are thinking generally, or they can sort of read the minds of their friends because they know them well, they know what they're thinking or what they're going to do, or that they could see the future because they can plan the future. They could see what's going to happen in the future broadly by planning. These are all pretty valid responses to these questions, again, in a non-clinical context. But these are places where these individuals would be flagged as invalid responders. The poodle question was certainly popular. There were a lot of things here. A lot of dog characteristics that are seen as positive, loyalty, things like that. Individuals who view their personality as dog-like or are dog people, that are really giving some valid reasons why they might agree with this statement. Some other things, the biweekly by leprechauns, breaking out the fact that this is potentially double-barreled, that individuals are paid biweekly, just not by leprechauns. A lot of things that when you start to read into it are places where these items are really starting to fail, at least in the classification. So these scales are working well as a whole. The problem is that some items on there really have broader interpretations than others, and those are going to drive up these false positives. Those scales, the published scales, Hang et al. And Mead and Craig, seem to be working pretty well. There are some weaker items on here, and there are potentially some things that could be done, combining these scales, a lot of things like that. But in general, they are working well. The other scales don't seem as strong. The sort of generated one for this scale, or certainly off-the-shelf items, simply didn't work as well as these published scales. Probably because those scales have already gone through some work to pull out some of the items that might have problems like this. The answer with items as well. Again, this was all very exploratory, but they worked in a very different way than we would have expected. Participants did seem to pull those out and treat them differently, at least some proportion of participants. And it would be interesting to see where that might go in the future. The take home here is that these scales do work well, but really shouldn't be viewed as error-free. If the scales are being used completely, there are enough items on there that are going to act as good checks. But if you're only using one or two of these items, it really increases the odds that you're going to get some false positives on there. If you're really only using one item, then your false positives are going to be quite a bit higher. It also starts to paint a picture of how checks, cut scores on these should be created and implemented in order to keep this in check and take account of what items might have these false positives more frequently than others. It's also the case that these on-the-fly items or off-the-shelf scales used for other things seem to not work as well on this as those scales that are on there. All items are not really equal on this task, and it's important to focus on those items that are really crafted and psychometrically validated for this sort of endeavor. All right, thanks for listening, and if you have any questions or comments on any of this, feel free to contact me. My contact information is below.